Friends, good evening, and welcome to TheoEd Talks. My name is Ryan Bonfilio, and I'll be your host for tonight's program. I can't tell you how incredible it is to see this room packed out as much as it is. We are completely sold out, standing room only, over 400 people packed into this room. I think it might be the most people in this room than ever before, and we are so glad to be sharing this program with you. I know there are a number of people in the room who are members at First Presbyterian Church, and some of you are actually back here in the same place for the second time today, having already worshiped with us this morning. If you're not Presbyterian, that's a really big thing, to be at church twice on a Sunday. And it's above my pay grade to offer bonus points, but I'm going to get with Tony Sundermeyer, our head of staff, and we're going to work out some deal for y'all. I also want to welcome those of you who might not be connected to First Presbyterian Church to this event. You actually make up about 90% of the audience. You come from across the greater Atlanta metro region, and you come from as far away as Louisville, Kentucky. Though TheoEd Talks is a ministry of First Presbyterian Church, we've always intended this to be an ecumenical event in service of the broader community, whether here in Atlanta or beyond. So whether you are a member of another church or you're someone who's just curious about faith, we are so glad to share this event with you tonight. I also want to recognize that we have over 100 students in the room from Atlanta colleges and seminaries. We're so glad you all are spending Sunday with us. I want to give a special shout out to my OT 501 students from Candler School of Theology. Where are you at? Now, I have to apologize. We're not going to have snazzy presentations to go along with the talks as I normally would do, but I am going to continue my no-quiz policy, so you can just sit back and relax and enjoy tonight's program. We are also live streaming this event on our Facebook page and through our website, TheoEd.com. So if you're joining in from us from afar, we're glad to have you as well. I know we at least have two people joining in with us through the live stream platform. Mom and Dad, hey, it's good to have you. I really hope your web browser is working at this point. My mom and dad deserve a lot of credit. They've been at a ton of events that I have done throughout my life, the vast majority of which have been wrestling matches at both high school and college. But here's the really good news. In comparison to those wrestling matches, there's a lot less likely of a chance that I'm going to put someone in a headlock before the night's over, though we'll see how the talks go. So, what is TheoEd Talks? This is a faith-based speaker series that we started here at First Presbyterian back in 2017. Its aim is to bring together leading thinkers in the church and the academy to give the talk of their lives in 20 minutes or less. And by packaging powerful ideas in bite-sized talks, we hope to spark conversations that change how we think about God, religion, and the power of faith to change lives and communities. The key is not just getting compelling speakers and having them address important topics, but rather it's putting it all together in a highly polished, short format talk that you can listen to and digest in the time that it takes to drop the kids off at school, or walk the dog, or, as I've recently learned, sit through one commercial break during the Super Bowl. You can access TheoEd Talks in one of three ways. First, you can join us for live events like this one. We host these about twice a year, and we've already scheduled our next TheoEd Talks event, which is coming up on Sunday, September 22nd. And I'll have more to tell you about the speakers of that event at the end of our program. Second, you can visit our web platform, TheoEd.com, where you can access for free past versions of all of our talks, as well as behind-the-scenes interviews with all of our previous speakers, including Lauren Winner, Shane Claiborne, Amy Jo Levine, and Greg Ellison. Third, you can subscribe to our podcast. Simply go to iTunes or SoundCloud, search for TheoEd Talks, and click to subscribe. However you access TheoEd Talks, we hope that they serve as a resource that enriches your own spiritual journey, but we also hope that they serve as something of a curriculum or a conversation starter that you can use in your Sunday school classes, small groups, or book clubs. Now, as all of you know, one of the distinctives of TheoEd Talks, really what sets it apart from most other church series, is that we invite speakers in not just to give a good lecture or a nice sermon. Rather, we invite speakers in to give the talk of their lives in 20 minutes or less. And admittedly, that's a really daunting task to give the talk of your life in 20 minutes or less. So naturally, our speakers have asked for examples. Give me something to listen to or watch to help set the mood so I can understand the genre. And so, of course, I direct them to our website. But recently, I've been thinking that perhaps the earliest and maybe purest prototype of a TheoEd talk actually comes from Saturday Night Live. Back in the early 80s, SNL had this recurring character named Father Sarducci. And if you're of a certain age, you might remember good Father Sarducci. He's basically a walking parody of an Italian Catholic priest. And he's involved in a lot of different sketches, but his favorites, the one he's most famous for, is something called the 5-Minute University. Here's how it works. Father Sarducci knows, and studies suggest this, that 5 years after graduating from college, most college graduates only can remember 5 minutes worth of stuff they learned during their college career. Now, that's really bad news if you're a parent paying for tuition right now. But don't worry, Father Sarducci has a solution to this. He's going to open up his own university, and it's called, of course, the 5-Minute University. And at Father Sarducci's university, he's only going to teach the 5 minutes worth of stuff that you're going to remember 5 years later. Why waste the time with all that other stuff? So, and it's great. It's only $20, and that includes tuition, a room and board, books, cap and gown, even snacks during spring break, which is only like 10 seconds. And at Father Sarducci's university, you can take a variety of different classes, but all of them are only going to give you a small little nugget of knowledge. So, you want to take economics? Easy. Supply and demand. That's it. You want to take business? Well, that's easy too. Buy stuff and sell it for more. Or, since you're in this room, you might be interested in theology. Well, at Father Sarducci's university, there's a theology class. And the main question of the class is, where is God? Answer? God's everywhere. Why? Because he likes you. I've always thought it was kind of the perfect combination of early 80s Disney movies with Roman Catholic theology. It's a great coming together. And that's it. You take all of your classes. It takes 5 minutes. You have finals. That's only 10 seconds. There's a ceremony. You get your cap and gown and diploma, and that's it. You're a college graduate. The original TheoEd talk in perfect form. I think it's a great idea, and in fact, I haven't run this by Jan Love yet. Jan is the dean of the Candler School of Theology, but I'm thinking of opening up a seminary just down the road from Father Sarducci's 5-Minute University, because you have another minute to spare? Before we get started for real for tonight's program, I want to pause and thank a few groups and individuals who have made this event possible. Financial support for TheoEd Talks comes from First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta and the John H. Stembler Endowment for Biblical and Theological Studies. I also want to thank the many staff members at First Pres, their talented communications team, and their many volunteers who make this event run so smoothly behind the scenes. I want to thank also Ross Boone, who is a very creative artist who has done all the illustrations that we have used both on our website and our promotional material. Ross, we're so grateful for your work. And finally, last but not least, let me thank Lydia Foreman, our Associate Director of TheoEd Talks. Lydia has done a ton, both in front of the scenes and behind the scenes, to make this work. And Lydia, we are so grateful for all of the gifts and talents that you've given to us for this program. So please join me in thanking everyone who has made this event possible. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Peter Enns. Pete has his PhD from Harvard University, and he currently serves as the Abram S. Clemens Professor of Biblical Studies at Eastern University, just outside of Philadelphia. Pete has written numerous books, including The Sin of Certainty, The Bible Tells Me So, and The Evolution of Adam. When Pete is not writing books or teaching classes, he's hosting a very popular podcast called The Bible for Normal People. And as you'll see in just a second, Pete is an incredibly engaging speaker who is helping lay audiences more deeply understand this strange and sacred text that we call Scripture. Pete's talk tonight is titled Reimagining an Ancient God, Here and Now. Please join me in welcoming Pete Enns.
Richard Dawkins was once asked by someone who was thinking of becoming an atheist, can you recommend a book for me to read to sort of help me on my way? And he said, yeah, the Bible. And the man's got a point, because believing in the God of the Bible, I don't mean like God in the abstract, but believing in the God of the Bible is not always easy. See, first of all, he lives in the sky. And Jesus ascends, he goes up to the sky to be with the Father, and where are they? Because there's really, technically speaking, no sky. Right, its atmosphere just keeps going for like a bazillion trillion light years and forever. Or the God of the Bible endorses and supports the structures of slavery. There are even laws there about how to govern slaves, but there's nothing about emancipating them. Or God is transactional, right? If you obey, you'll be blessed. If you disobey, you'll be cursed. Which sounds a little harsh, not like, oh, I can't wait to get to know this God. It seems a little bit tense, Or God's sort of go-to means of conflict resolution in the Bible seems to be a lot of people die. Violence, right? I mean, war, pestilence, plague, famine, the ground opens up to swallow a few thousand people. I mean, think about this. Our big, long Bible, right? Genesis, you get to chapter 6 and everybody dies. Oh, Lord, that's it? That's all you got? You've already run out of patience. It's chapter 6 of the Bible, for heaven's sake. There's no plan B, in other words, right? Or God is very concerned about his reputation. Honor and shame. Don't shame me. I will be honored. I will be glorified. Which, again, is a bit harsh. It's like my students say, it seems like God is a little bit self-centered and really too concerned about what he looks like to other people. Or there are laws. Laws are fine. I'm not against law or anything like that. But some of the laws in the Bible, I mean, this is what the universe is about, right? Okay. You see that animal over there? You can eat that one. You see the one over there? I know it looks like that one, but it's got different kind of hooves and it chews differently. Unclean, don't eat it. And that thing that's coming out of the water, you think it's a fish, but it's not. It's got a hard shell. You can't eat that either. Oh, and let me see. You can stone your rebellious teenage son, and virgin daughters are the property of their fathers. Thus saith me. Any questions? Or God micromanages everything in the Bible. It seems like everything happens according to the word of the Lord. He even micromanages the weather as a form of punishment or reward. I remember years ago, Pat Robertson of the 700 Club was talking about a hurricane that was descending on the coast of Virginia, and he said this is God's punishment for the state of Virginia. I don't remember, they voted wrong or something. I have no idea what they did. But that night, Jon Stewart said, isn't it funny how God's wrath always shows up during hurricane season? I miss him terribly, by the way. But I remember thinking to myself, that's it, right? That's the problem. The God of the Bible, the way he's portrayed, it's not easy to believe in this God because it doesn't fit our common experience. And our experience is going to affect how we think about God. Now, I've been told many times, you should never let your experience affect your theology. I'm like, well, what else do I got? I mean, I can't help it when and where I was born. I could teleport back into the Iron Age. That might be easier, but I can't do that. I live here, so I have to reimagine what God is like. And here's the good thing. See, the Bible, okay, it's sort of a problem, right? But the Bible also provides, it models a way forward. It's not a silver bullet, it's not an easy answer, but it models something for us that I think is of great spiritual benefit. It's basically this. The writers of the Bible are already reimagining the God of old for new experiences and new circumstances. I think that's a beautiful thing. See, this is why, of all the great stories in the Old Testament that I think talk about this, my two favorite are the books of Jonah and Job, because they're both about reimagining what God is like. So how does Jonah reimagine God? Well, Jonah, I'm not sure how you're going to take this, but I actually like your enemies, and I want them to prosper, and I want them saved, or whatever word we want to use. Even the Assyrians, the dreaded Assyrians, who were like the superpower semi-ISIS of the day, even them. Jonah doesn't like it, but he does it, and it works. See, the book of Jonah is reimagining the God of, let's say, the book of Nahum, another one of the minor prophets, where there it's a very different tone about the Assyrians. There, God uses language like vengeance and destroy, and I've had it with you. And then the town of Nineveh, the city, the capital of Assyria, is wiped out. Now, Nahum has a little bit of like historical veracity to it in this sense that in the year 612 BCE, the capital of Nineveh fell. Jonah is a parable. It's not about a fish. It's not about any of that stuff. It's a parable about who's an insider and who's an outsider to the God of the universe. And he gives a different kind of answer. Jonah reimagines what God is like. Because Jonah was written after the return from the Babylonian exile. So what? Here's a so what. They're in captivity for, 50, 60 years. And they're getting to know people who were their enemies. And they're sort of like, honey, have you met the Babylonian neighbors? They're like really, really nice. I mean, I don't understand a word they're saying, but they're nice. And I think they want us to come over for dinner or something. And they want to play date with our kids. They have beer, for heaven's sake. This is like the most amazing place. Maybe, you know what? We could have been Babylonians had we been born here. But we were born someplace else. Is God just our private possession, or is God bigger than we might imagine? Maybe God cares for the enemy too. I had a similar experience. When I left seminary to go to graduate school, people said, okay, you go to Harvard, just don't learn anything. Just keep your head low, don't just go to a good church, blah, blah, all that kind of stuff. I ignored every word they said. But I got there and I realized that these people, well, forgive me, people, you know, and who had no idea what I was thinking about. No idea. They couldn't really articulate what I believed. Just because they were born in Israel or other parts of the world. And I remember thinking to myself, first of all, they're nice people. And I enjoy their company, and they babysat my kids. But are they really on the outside looking in, and I'm on the inside looking out because of where I was born? Had I been born there, I'd be like them. Had they been born here, they might have been like me. So what kind of a God are we talking about here? If I can have compassion on them, oh, so help me, God better have more compassion than I do. I had to reimagine God from what I was taught based on my experience. Or the book of Job. I love the book of Job. Job reimagines God this way. Hey, are you suffering? Yeah, God's not doing that to you. Right? You know the story of Job? He's not doing well, okay? His friends come to him and they say, Job, you don't look too good. What did you do to deserve that? Right? Because see, his friends, they're working from this idea of a transactional God. If you obey, you'll be blessed. If you disobey, you'll be cursed. And they go to Job and they say, you know, Job, I've read the book, and like for the first few verses, you're doing great, right? You're blessed, like way blessed, more than anybody else. And you're like the best Yahweh worshiper ever in the history of humanity. It's like you do everything and you're so scrupulous. You see, there's got to be a causal connection. You obeyed and you're blessed. Now you're clearly cursed. Ipso facto, what did you do? What did you do to make that transaction change? And of course, what does Job say? Nothing. And his friends say, yeah, you did. And Job says, no, I didn't. And his friends say, yes, you did. And Job says, no, I didn't. And his friends say, yeah, you did. And Job says, no, I did. 36 chapters of this back and forth to drive home the point, right? And what's beautiful is you get to the end of this complicated and sort of weird ending to the book, but there's one moment in this book which for me is literally the highlight of the entire Old Testament. It's when Job is there with the friends. They're still friends apparently, but Job is with the friends and God shows up. And he looks at one of Job's friends and he says, my wrath is kindled against you and your friends, for you have not spoken rightly of me as my friend Job has. You catch that? Right? The boys are doing the whole transactional thing over here, and Job's like, okay, I get it, and I did that in chapter 1. But something happened. God can't be like that. I refuse to believe that God is like that. And God backs him up. It should be that easy, right? When we get into theological debates. God backs him up. See, this is a radical reimagining of the way God is portrayed. Forgive me, throughout much of the Old Testament, not all of it, but read Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, a bunch of the prophets, a bunch of other things. It's very transactional. And Job takes that to task. He's reimagining God. Why? Just like Jonah. On the basis of his experience, he's got to think about God differently. And speaking of thinking of God differently, let's talk about the Jesus part of the Bible, right? You've got the gospel. What is the gospel if not a rather hefty, sustained reimagining of the God of old? Not dismissing the God of old, but reimagining the God of old just the way Jews have been doing it for centuries before. Think of anything of semi-importance in the Old Testament. Something happens with it in the New. Think like the land, which is not semi-important. That's hugely important. All right, Abraham, here you go. I promise you this land is a perpetual holding. Don't screw it up, right? And if you're in the land, that means I'm happy with you. If you're outside the land, it means I'm not happy with you, right? Jesus, my kingdom is not of this world. Yeah, it is. It's about this geopolitical entity called the land of Canaan, which our God promised to us as a... No, this is the point. But you see, Jesus is reimagining what God is like. Maybe God isn't concerned about that piece of real estate. Or the temple, right? Temple's sort of a big deal in the Old Testament, right? This is where, well, a lot of stuff happens. The glory of God resides there. The Spirit of God is there. All these things. It's like, this is the hub to connect with God. And what does Jesus say? I'm the temple. And then Paul takes it a step further, as he usually does, and he says to the church at Corinth, which was a loser church, by the way. They had nothing going for them, nothing right. He says to the church at Corinth, you are the temple of the Holy Spirit. See, it's reimagining the way in which God communes with humanity. That is a radical major shift. Or the law, right? The law is sort of important in the Old Testament, right? Here's the law. The law is that thing which defines the behaviors and the attitudes and the essence of what it means to be a child of Abraham. And Paul comes along and he says, doesn't throw it out, doesn't get rid of it, but he moves it to the periphery. The law now has a different function. And in its place, he puts, well, Jesus. So he says to the Gentiles, you too can be a child of Abraham, full-fledged child of Abraham, equal with your Jewish brothers and sisters, but not by this part, but by this part. That is a radical act of reimagining God and the community of God. We know this because Paul got a ton of opposition from his own Jewish brothers who were also followers of Jesus. Said, Paul, you went too far. Even Peter, right? Jesus's handpicked super disciple, right? It's too much for him. And James, Jesus' brother. I want to repeat that. Jesus' own brother. Both of them are like rulers of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. For them, it went too far. And Paul said, no, that's the gospel. And Paul won. Paul's act of reimagining the God of old won, and I know that because I'm standing here and I'm a Gentile. And I'm talking about Jesus, and you're out there, and if you're not of Jewish heritage, we all benefit from that radical act of reimagining. The church doesn't exist without that act of reimagining the God of old. And then for me, the big thing that, I have to tell you, this is the one that keeps me going some days when I'm not feeling great about all this stuff, which happens. And it's the cross. It's not enough to say, and I wish no one taught me this, and that bothers me. No one ever pointed this out to me. There's something I've always missed about this. The cross is not just, well, Jesus died for your sins, or Jesus suffered and died for your sins. It's Jesus was humiliated and shamed for you. In fact, God participates in this shaming and humiliating activity. That's what a cross is. The Romans perfected this means of execution, which was not just Jesus could have been beheaded. Why crucifixion? That's what the Romans do, and its purpose, this is documented, its purpose is to humiliate and to shame. And so this is how God shows up, the God of honor of the Old Testament, of mountains and all this creation. He shows up aligned with crucifixion. That's utter nonsense, which Paul says, to the Jews, it's a stumbling block. You better believe it is. To the Greeks, it's an offense. It's outrageous. It's ridiculous. Yeah, it is. But for us, it's the wisdom of God. That is a major act of reimagining what God is like. Or in Romans, he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why would he be ashamed? Because of how it begins. Right? See, okay, if you're living in the Greco-Roman world, or frankly, any time in human history, you're going to start a religion. Number one, okay, guys, we're agreed. We're not going to have our God shamed, right? Okay, good. Check that off the box. This is how it begins. So Paul has to say, I'm not ashamed, even though I know I should be, because that shaming is the power of God. That is a major act of reimagining what God is like. Our whole faith is based on this. And I think we all reimagine God. I know I do. Like all the time, it drives me crazy, but I don't know what else to do. I have to align my experience with my faith somehow. I have to have them at least talking to each other. The big one for me is, the universe. How big can you get? That's the big one for me. It's very big. And it's also teeny tiny. And it's also very, very old. And now I've got to think of a God and wrap my arms around all that. And also this God cares about me. Right? How can you have a personal God with a universe that's that big and impersonal? That's not a small question to ask. Does God count the hairs on my head? Does he listen when I pray? Listen, I stopped praying for a parking space at the mall a long time ago, all right? I'm not looking for that kind of individualized attention, but just a little bit of a sense of like, how do I know that I matter in this tremendous cosmos we live in? Or evolution. I mean, I wrote a book about evolution a few years ago, and I think about that a lot, and it's not really compatible with Christianity that I can see. It's not really compatible. And it's not because of Adam. That is frankly, forgive me, that is child's play. That's the easiest thing to deal with. The hard part is how much time it took, how relatively random it seems, and the fact that what makes evolution go is death. Death is evolution's buddy. Okay? Death is Christianity's enemy. Okay, now, work it out. How do those things come to... That's hard work. But it's an act of reimagination. Mental health, right? My family, there was mental health on both sides. My kids never had a chance, by the way. It just came down genetically, forget it, right? But, I get it. But the thing is that when something happens, I know where I need to go. To a really good doctor and a really good therapist and get the medication regulated. Right? I don't I got to pray and God will solve this. It's not reading the Bible or going to a Bible study or listening to a sermon series. That's not going to address it. It's like, okay, Lord, she's depressed. Why don't you sit this one out? I'm going to go call a psychiatrist, and maybe you're busy with, just take care of ISIS and hunger, and I'll just worry about this. So again, see, it's a matter of, is God really... Are we just chemicals? And what does it mean to have a God over us? And how do these things work together? And I don't really know the answer to that, but I know that I have to think about God differently. I have to make room in my experience for a God like this. And I'm not looking for things. I'm just alive and aware and breathing, and these things just hit me, and I'm just scratching the surface, as I'm sure you are too. Now, here's the thing. I could be wrong. I could be really, really wrong about how I reimagine God. But I am not wrong for trying. Right? Reimagining God and asking, what is God like here and now? That is the question of faith. That is the question of theology. And when I try to answer that question, I'm not being disloyal to the tradition. I'm actually doing what the tradition's already been doing. I'm not attacking the tradition and trying to kill it. I'm trying to keep it going, at least for myself, by addressing things and taking things into account that the tradition itself never dreamed of. When I'm trying to answer this question for myself, it's not like I'm being fast and loose with all this stuff. I'm actually taking my faith seriously and my experience seriously. Trying to answer the question, what is God like here and now? It's not trendy, it's not foolish, it's not foolhardy, it's not rebellion. It is, in fact, nothing less than our sacred responsibility as people of faith. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Pete, for that engaging talk and for challenging us to not get stuck on one understanding of God, but really to have the courage to follow the Bible's lead in reimagining God in new contexts and in new ways. That's the spirit of our faith. And if you're interested in learning more about that topic, Pete has a new book coming out within days called How the Bible Actually Works. And it has a deliciously long subtitle. I actually had to write it down because it was so long. How the Bible Actually Works, in which I explain how an ancient, ambiguous, and diverse book leads us to wisdom rather than answers, and why that's great news. Leave it to an academic to come up with a great subtitle. Thank you very much, Pete. Our second speaker tonight is Dr. Diana Butler Bass. Having a PhD from Duke University, Diana is an award-winning author of 10 books, including Grounded, Christianity After Religion, and Grateful. Diana regularly writes for various news outlets, including The Washington Post, The Huffington Post, Newsweek, and The New York Times. She also frequently appears on CNN, PBS, and NPR. Diana travels the country talking at conferences in churches and seminaries about various aspects of American religion and spiritual formation, with her signature insightful wisdom and her refreshing wit. We're so grateful to have Diana here. Her talk tonight is titled, Jesus the Ingrate, the Subversive Politics of Gratitude. Please join me in welcoming Diana Butler Bass.
Gratitude might well be the most primal of all human experiences. And it also might be the most ancient of our spiritual practices. Somewhere, tens of thousands of years ago, a person came out of a cave, looked up at the night sky, and said, "Thank you. Thank you." It's so beautiful. It's intuitive. It was that moment, that insight, that helped to make us more fully human, to recognize that the whole of the universe was a gift, and that we as small beings could respond to gifts and say thank you. It is that action and that insight that becomes central to all of the religious traditions that human beings would ever imagine and would ever practice. It's that native, that natural, and that important to who we are. And so I have only one question. Why is it so hard? Because it really is. Gratitude is not that easy. And all of those religious traditions born in that heartbeat of saying thanks have always known that. They have known that gratitude is more than just that remarkable moment of looking up and saying thank you, but that it was something else as well. It was a calling into a moral way of being, into a way of life that would help us to be able to live in a world of giftedness and abundance, and that it would be a response, that we could live responsibly and responsively to gods or the God who made us and to our neighbors. So it's two things. It's that emotional response, and it is a moral choice. Perhaps no single verse in the Christian tradition illustrates the difficulty of gratitude quite as well as a verse in 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians is actually the oldest book in the Christian New Testament. It is the most ancient piece of theology that we own. And it is a book that talks a lot about thanks. The beginning of it is a long discursive section on thanks and gratitude. And then the book arcs through a whole bunch of questions that were very puzzling to early Christians and ends up with 1 Thessalonians 5:18. In everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Now, I don't know about you and your experience if you are a Christian. I am a Christian. I grew up with these texts, these stories, these beautiful scriptures. And one of the things that happens with that Bible verse is it goes on a lot of posters. It's in pastors' offices. It hangs up in dorm rooms at Christian colleges of my female friends. It usually had like waterfalls and pink flowers on it. And I actually sort of came to hate that verse because it always seemed like a kind of Hallmark card to me. But there was something about it that went well beyond Hallmark cards that really bothered me. And what bothered me was the beginning and the end of the verse. The beginning of the verse says, "In all things give thanks." In all things? In everything that happens in my life, give thanks. Give thanks when I fail at something, when I am in despair, have lost hope, someone I know is sick, or a relative has died. Give thanks in those things. And I tell you, all of us have experienced our fair share of disappointment, doubt, and despair. And yet that verse just stands there. In all things give thanks. No, thank you, I say. And it's not just in those things that might upset my own small personal world, but the things that happen when I turn on the television or open up Twitter and I see pictures of a refugee child who is dead in the waters off of European shores. Or I hear about a genocide that's taking place across the planet, a whole group of people being wiped out because of their religion. When I know how much the economic system in which I am complicit keeps other people poor so that I might be rich. When I experience, as we are all experiencing right now, these wild weather patterns which are a sign that our earth is screaming out for us to attend to it. In all things give thanks. Well, count me out. I'm not going to give thanks for any of those things. As a matter of fact, when I hear those things, I get angry and I want to yell back at whoever is that really nice church person standing at the other side of the aisle saying to me, in all things give thanks. Ugh! No. I have no thanks. I do not feel grateful. As a matter of fact, I think when it comes to all of these things, I am an ingrate. And so, there it was. I took that little verse, and I took that call to gratitude, and I put it in a sort of gratitude box, and I put it on the side of my life of faith, and I went on with things. And so I started studying and writing theology about the big stuff, the really important stuff in Scripture, the stuff about the reign of God, the kingdom of God, God's love and God's justice intertwined with one another, God's dream for the whole of the cosmos for restoration, reconciliation, and salvation. That was the meat of the gospel. That was the flow of what was really important in theology. And that's what I invested my time in. And then, a couple of years ago, I felt called to start looking at the things that I had put in boxes, the things on the sides that I had not paid much attention to. And that little box marked gratitude, it seemed to call out to me. And so I decided to write a book on gratitude. A lot of my friends in mindfulness communities and meditation communities were telling me that gratitude was good for me. And not only gratitude would it be good for me, but the people who practice gratitude live longer. In my late 50s, I really liked the sound of that. And so I opened up the box and I said, I'm going to write about this. And I'm going to try to write about it from a distinctly biblical, distinctly Christian perspective. And maybe I'll learn a thing or two. And maybe my books will start selling really well because those kinds of nice devotionals with pink covers always sell really well. And as I studied gratitude, something happened that I never anticipated. And that is, gratitude began to open up. And I realized that I wasn't just looking at some little practice that could be put in a box on the side of my life, but that gratitude was actually one of the most important themes in the whole of Scripture. Through the Hebrew Bible, all the way to the New Testament, the ministry of Jesus, and the very end, in the book of Revelation, that gratitude was not a minor chord, it was a major chord. It was one of the threads that weaves through everything. And that gratitude actually is part of the reign of God. It is part of God's compassion and justice. It is part of God's dream for us. And so gratitude became not a little story, but a big story, a narrative by which to look at the whole narrative of Scripture. And in the midst of that, something really, truly surprising began to happen. Is that second part of the verse, the one that goes, "This is God's will for you in Jesus Christ," that began to pop. Because I had always thought about gratitude not only as a sort of minor chord, something that could be put on the side, but it really troubled me because Jesus was implicated in it. And that somehow to be a good follower of Jesus, you had to give thanks and praise to Jesus, and Jesus was an example of a perfectly thankful life. And that if I was going to follow that Jesus, I had to imitate that Jesus. And when I did this study of gratitude, when I began thinking about gratitude differently, Jesus became different. And Jesus was not just the object of praise and thankfulness. Jesus was not just the example, but instead, Jesus, thank goodness, emerged as an ingrate too. And I felt relieved by that. To understand Jesus as an ingrate is a really important call for this particular day and time in our culture. Jesus himself lived in the intersection of two really important cultures. One was his own Jewish heritage and Jewish community, and the second was Roman imperialism in the Mediterranean world. These two cultures were constantly in conflict with one another. And what's fascinating about them is they had two different, very distinctive views of gratitude. The Roman view of gratitude was not just as a moral practice, not just as a sort of nice thing to do. Remember to send your Aunt Lydia a thank you card after the holiday for the sun. But instead, it was a political, economic, and social practice. If you think about the way the ancient Roman Empire was structured, it was like this, a pyramid. At the top is Caesar and his friends. At the bottom are people who are peasants, slaves, small farmers, freed slaves, and subjects of Roman imperialism. There's a middle group too, mostly soldiers, artisans, merchants, sort of the bureaucrats who kept the Roman Empire going. And I've always wondered about these kinds of structures and how they stay in place because they're inherently unstable. Even though most people are at the bottom, giving the pyramid a big base, most wealth is at the top. And so those people are the richest and most powerful, and it flows down negatively towards the people on the bottom. So how in the world do you keep a social structure like that going, especially a social structure like ancient Rome, which lasted for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and still actually has an impact on us today? Well, you keep it going basically in two ways. One, a really big, bad army, and lots of violence. And two, you have to have a social structure that invests people in some way in this particular unfair and oppressive pyramid. That social structure in ancient Rome was referred to as the patronage system. And the way it worked was quite simple. The people at the top were considered to be the ones who held all the benefits, and those people were responsible to pass some of the benefits of Roman largesse down to everyone else in the pyramid. When those people at the top, the patrons, passed stuff down, they were responsible to feed people and to make sure people were safe. And so protection and provision and also some level of political power moved from there to there. The people at the bottom then had a responsibility. Their job was to pass stuff back up as an act of appreciation to their benefactors. This was all held together by force of law. Gifts flowed down, and then thanks flowed up. And the gifts of thanks that we, the people on the bottom, were supposed to give were taxes, tithes, tributes, worship, honor, utter loyalty, and the complete obligation that our whole lives were given over to Caesar and Caesar's empire. This was not something you entered into because you signed a contract or because you wanted to. This was the law. And this system of patronage was a system of gratitude. The stuff that got sent down, those benefits, in Latin, that word was gratus. And the stuff that was sent back up, in Latin, same word, gratus. When it comes down, it's translated grace or favor. When it goes up, it's translated gratitude. This was a system of obligatory gratitude that put people in debt to one another always. If someone gave you something, you had to discharge the debt. It was the law. And if you didn't, you could be exiled, sent to prison, or executed. That's where we get the English word gratitude. And that, of course, is where Jesus comes into the story. Jesus lived in a time when that was gratus. That was gratitude. And many of Jesus' encounters are encounters about this system of patronage, including a very simple story that if you are a Christian person, you probably know this story from your childhood up. And that is a story where Jesus meets a tax collector named Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is, like Jesus, a Jew. And Zacchaeus had become a tax collector. People could become tax collectors not by going to, like, Jerusalem Business School of Taxes. But instead, people became tax collectors because once a year, the Roman authorities, which were very clever, would auction off a few numbers of higher status positions to people who were subjects of Roman imperialism. And you could bid on them, and you could win a higher position in the social structure. And so Zacchaeus, that's how he would have become a tax collector, by bidding on a job and rising up in the social structure. Of course, his job was then to make sure that benefits got down to the poor people, in which case he would skim stuff off as they were making their way down, and that gratitude got back up to Caesar, in which case he would skim stuff off when it was moving the other way. Zacchaeus benefited from Roman gratitude. And so there is Zacchaeus and Jesus. As the story goes, Zacchaeus hears that Jesus is coming to town, and we're told he's short. So he runs to the edge of town, he climbs a tree, gets up in a tree, and he wants to be the first person in Jericho to see Jesus. Jesus sees him, they have this lovely little chat, and then they go out to dinner. It's a wonderful Bible story for elementary school kids. And that's not what it means at all. What happens is that Zacchaeus hears that Jesus is coming to town, and he knows something about Jesus. That is, Jesus has been talking about Caesar and taxes in other places, and Zacchaeus is terrified. What is this guy going to say when he gets to Jericho? Is he going to tell people to pay their taxes? Is he not going to tell people to pay their taxes? Is he going to offer one of these crazy parables that he always does and nobody knows what he means by the whole thing? I have got to hear this before anybody else does because this impacts me and my job. And so Zacchaeus does the only thing Zacchaeus knows to do, and that is he runs to the edge of town and he climbs up a tree. Why? Because that's what Zacchaeus does. He's a climber. He climbs in front of everybody in order to get a better view, in order to improve his position with the people in authority. And Jesus sees this guy up in the tree, and he knows everything that's going on with Zacchaeus. And he says, "Hey, you, Zacchaeus, get out of that tree. This is not about a tree." Jesus is saying, Zacchaeus, you come down from that system where you have put yourself as a complicit agent of Roman imperialism. You get out of those branches, disentangle yourself, come down, be on ground with me. And then, of course, Zacchaeus does it. He's so shocked. And Jesus says to him, "Oh, and by the way, I'm coming to your house for dinner tonight. I'm taking you out of that system and structure of gratitude, and I'm putting you into God's vision of gratitude. A table, not a pyramid. A place where gifts are abundant, not scarce. A place where we're all receivers and all givers, that not just a few of us give and the others of us are in debt forever to the people above us." Zacchaeus hears this invitation and he takes it. And not only does he hear it, but he says to Jesus, "Yes, yes, yes." And you know it's political because what he does next, he says, "By the way, I'm going to give everything back that I have stolen, and all of the people I have defrauded, I'm going to make it right." He quits his job as a tax collector, and he goes and he has dinner with Jesus, and Jesus says, "Today, salvation has come to this house." Jesus is an ingrate to the Roman system of gratitude that enslaves us in debt, that holds us in oppression, and that is a system that, based in this beautiful word, has twisted it and corrupted it beyond recognition. And Jesus says, "No, I am not grateful." And instead, Jesus resets the ancient story of the Hebrew people. Lord, God, can you set a table in the wilderness? Best question ever asked in the Hebrew Bible. And God, of course, says yes. And that's the question that Jesus answers over and over again. Can we be grateful? Can we be God's people? Can we live a life of jubilee, of thanks, of Sabbath, of true, deep gratitude? Yes, Jesus says. God's dream is here. But you have to be able to discern the difference between these systems and structures of gratitude. Please, Jesus says, come down out of the tree and sit around a table. Or maybe Jesus is asking us finally to come out of the caves where we've been hiding in fear and to finally look up and see the beauty and abundance of the universe and go back to the people we were always intended to be. Thank you.
Thank you. That's amazing. I appreciate it. Well, Diana, thank you for that compelling and powerful look at the topic of gratitude, what it looks like from God's perspective, why it can be subversive, and how it can change our way of being in this world. I'm so grateful for that, Diana. And if you're interested in Diana's work, she's actually going to be back in Atlanta later in March talking about this same topic, and we've included some flyers right outside on the book tables if you're interested in more information. Our third speaker tonight is Mike McHargue, better known by most as Science Mike. He is a podcaster, writer, and speaker who travels the world helping those who have been turned off by the church rediscover faith in fresh and authentic ways. His first book, Finding God in the Waves, was a bestseller and is helping thousands of people understand what it means to believe in God in the 21st century. He is the host of a question and answer podcast called Ask Science Mike, and he is the co-host of the Liturgist podcast with his friend Michael Gungor. With over 1 million downloads per month, the Liturgist podcast is easily one of the most popular podcasts in American Christianity today. Mike's talk tonight is Wishing for the End, Responding to America's Suicide Crisis. Please join me in welcoming Mike McHargue.
I hate it when people ask me what I do. I absolutely hate it. I'm a podcaster. So people are like, oh, my nephew podcasts after school. It's like, no, I do it. I do that for a living. I'm a professional podcaster. So sometimes I'll try to dodge the whole podcaster thing, and I'll say, well, I'm an author. I write books. And the problem with either talking about books or podcasts is I figure out how quickly we take a functional view of each other. People are trying to assess how I contribute to society and what I'm all about. And I just don't think author or podcaster gets it. And so when I'm in the back of an Uber and my Uber driver wants to know what I do, I just don't know that podcasting and writing books describes it. And I've really been trying to figure out, what do I do? And I realized my work is about destigmatizing things. I have conversations that people don't like to have for a living. And I tell you that tonight because my talk is about something that almost no one wants to talk about. And I'm going to be extremely honest and extremely vulnerable as we go through that. So I just want to take a moment to tell you, don't forget to breathe. If in this room something I say brings up something in your past into this room, I want you to know that I support you doing what you need to do to be healthy, even if that's walking out in the middle of my talk. And if you're watching online and something I say triggers something in your past, just hit the pause button, take a breath, and come back later, because I'll be here. That's how the internet works. This is officially as scared as I've ever been on stage. The barrel of a shotgun tastes like pocket change and fireworks. Just the moment the metal hits your mouth, there's an overpowering metal sensation, just like sticking your tongue on a 9-volt battery. And it's quickly followed by a pungent smell of gunpowder and subtle notes of oil. Now, what you'll notice when you try to put a shotgun in your mouth is that the angles are difficult. Shotguns are really long. And so you have to bow your head almost like you're in prayer. But if your goal is to take your own life and you do the research ahead of time, you realize that many people fail to die by suicide with a shotgun because they get the angle wrong. And so very difficultly, you tilt your head back to try to maximize the amount of shell that penetrates your gray matter. When you do so, the barrel sight will press painfully into your gums behind your front teeth. It really hurts. It will actually bring tears to your eyes. But the pain seems passable because you only have a few moments left to live. Unfortunately, I didn't realize how hard it is to reach the trigger of a shotgun when it's in your mouth. So rather awkwardly, I had to reach down and remove a shoe and slip off the sock so I could put my toe in the trigger. And then I felt a moment of such incredible remorse because I was sitting on my parents' bed and it was my father's gun. I imagined either mom or dad walking into their bedroom and finding me scattered everywhere. And it was almost enough to keep me from pulling the trigger. Almost. I don't know if a lot of people know what it feels like to pull a trigger aimed at yourself and be able to tell the story. Thank God I'm incompetent with firearms. I loaded it wrong. So all I got was this clunk that I felt even more than I heard. It reverberated through my skull. And I dropped the gun on the ground and collapsed on the floor in tears because I was such a failure, I couldn't even take my own life. And that was the first, but not the last time that I tried to die by suicide. We don't like to talk about suicide in any part of culture. I can't find any part of America, religious or unreligious, that's comfortable talking about suicide. And I think it's because it forces us all to confront the simple fact that everyone is going to die. And so when someone tells you that in some way they want to die, that they wish to die, even that they fantasize about dying, that brushes up against the most basic survival impulses that have been wired into your brain by billions of years of biological evolution. But I actually believe that in a strange way, suicide might be the great unifier. What do LGBTQ teens and white, rural, conservative men have in common these days? They both lead others in the rate at which they take their own lives. But we don't like to talk about that. We don't like to talk about the fact that there are suicide corridors in this country around the Mountain West where rates for men and women skyrocket with suicide. We don't like to talk about 1.4 million attempts per year. We don't like to talk about the feeling of helplessness and the feelings of loss we all have, especially because most suicides aren't accompanied by a note. How is it that so many people can take their own lives? How is it that First Nations and Indigenous Americans are starting to catch up with queer teenagers and Republican men? What's happening in our society? If you think about it, it's a truly remarkable feat. I like to think of the brain like a burrito. Because structurally they're very similar, at least the ones I have in Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, which are truly exceptional. If you take a starter, I prefer carnitas. That's the building blocks of a burrito, and then you put rice around that, and then you wrap it in a tortilla. That structure is not unlike your brain, only the carnitas is the basal ganglia, which is a real medical term that does in fact sound dirty, that describes where all the survival functions in your brain are. And then outside of that is your mammalian brain, also called the limbic system, that gives you feelings like love and fear and anger and joy. And then wrapped around that is your neocortex, which is actually about as thick as a tortilla. It's just wrinkled up and rolled up. Well, in that apparatus, the part of your brain that makes decisions and has rational communication is about as big around as a quarter and as thick as a tortilla. And I want you to think about that in capacity of the entire brain. It's a tiny patch of tissue. And yet somehow that little patch of tissue is able to begin a process we see almost nowhere else in the animal world. The only animals that willfully end their lives are highly intelligent. Dolphins can end their own lives. For example, their breath process is voluntary, unlike our involuntary breathing process. And sometimes when dolphins are kept in captivity and they've had enough, they simply sink to the bottom of a tank and never breathe again. And I think our fundamental ignorance about how suicide happens in the brain and the psychology behind it is what makes us feel so powerless to talk about it in every form of community in the West. And I, as an expert in suicide, have searched for years and years for something in the academy that could provide insight. And it's funny that the theory I found that compels me the most actually came out of Florida State University, which is in Tallahassee, Florida, where I grew up. There's a man there named Thomas Joyner, and he's devoted his professional career to researching suicide. It's probably related that his gregarious and outgoing Southern father took his own life when Thomas was still young. And he's come up with one of the only data-driven, comprehensive theories of suicide that I'm aware of. And if you take nothing from this talk today, I hope you take away these 3 simple ideas. They're core beliefs that someone has to have to enter a state of suicidality. Number 1, I am alone. We're social primates. We are, in fact, the most social of all the primates on Earth. I don't know if you've ever seen 500 chimpanzees in a room at the same time, but I'm guessing you have not. And yet this is not an exceptionally large crowd of Homo sapiens. We're extremely social. In fact, so social that we equate survival with social standing. We have flight or fight responses over our reputations. So when we believe that we're alone, we question if it's worth the effort to continue to survive. Belief number 2, I am a burden on others. When people believe that they're a burden on other people, especially in cases of mental health difficulties or chronic illness, they believe that what they contribute to relationships is net negative. And we never talk about this because we're Westerners. We're Protestants. We're Catholics. If there's one thing the church has in common, it's this ridiculous notion that we're supposed to be self-sufficient. It's the unifying bond of American religion, especially white American religion. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. A few years ago, I fell off of a motorcycle and struck my head on the ground quite hard. My brain bled in 2 places. And the first talk I gave after that event, I stood on stage and about 5.5 minutes into the talk, had no idea what to say next. And it means that whenever I talk, even if notes aren't allowed, I have to have a little clicker because every 5 minutes I have to see the next thing I'm going to talk about or I can't do it anymore. And when I talk about that, with people who've asked me to come speak at their institutions, do you know how I feel? I feel terrible because I feel like I'm a burden. I'm an adult who's been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And it's always sad to me that my best friend, who's my wife, is really also my full-time caretaker in a way that the public can't imagine. And so often, I, a relatively successful D-list internet celebrity, I think it's hard for people to imagine how much I feel like a burden to my wife and to the people I work with at the liturgists and to my close friends because, folks, I actually can't get through the day on my own. Now, if you believe that you're alone, that no one really cares for you, no one accepts you as you are, and you're a burden, those two things create suicidality. They create a suicidal imagination or thoughts of suicide, the contemplation of suicide, and people can stay in that space for years. But it takes a third belief to take you from suicidal imagination to attempting to die by suicide. And that third belief is, I am not afraid to die. Fear of death is hardwired into the human organism. I escaped it through a particular belief that even if I took my own life, I would go to heaven. And that belief, that suicide was not an unpardonable sin, is what made me confident enough to pull a trigger on a gun aimed at my skull. But that's not the only reason people lose the fear of death. Oddly enough, when we look at people who are taking antidepressants, we find that they are at an elevated suicide risk. And if you think about it, how could a medication that helps treat mental illness and makes you feel better lead to an increase in the suicide rate? Because the same mechanism in an antidepressant that makes depression seem more distant also makes your fear of death feel more distant. And so, ironically, when people have the first two beliefs in their mind, it is in fact the antidepressant that helps them get the rest of the way to try and take their own life. I am alone. I am a burden. I am not afraid to die. I can't help but notice that people of color just don't commit suicide at the same rate that white people do. And it's not close. It's really not close. Something about our culture, the dominant culture, the normative culture in the United States, has idolized self-sufficiency to a degree that we can't reach out to the people closest to us when we're struggling to literally survive every single day. We are too afraid to be real because we're so afraid of looking bad. We also understand that today we have new forms of media. There are digital social media in our world that captivate our attention, but mental health experts are telling us that when social media is a substitute for face-to-face interaction, it has a negative effect on mental health, including suicidality. But when it's used as a supplement to face-to-face interaction, it helps create healing and helps people feel not alone. But I think the biggest thing is, it's the shame. No one wants to admit that they want to die. They're afraid of being judged. They're afraid of being rejected. Remember, these are people who already feel utterly alone. And I believe the church should be on the front lines of America's war with suicide. Why? Because the church is a place that's already structured to foster face-to-face human connection. The church is already a place where we should feel comfortable discussing our deepest fears, the kinds of things we see people wrestle with in the Bible, the kinds of big questions that people ask in beautiful rooms with stained glass windows. Here's my challenge to you. If you are a person who has never struggled with thoughts of suicide, I have homework for you. Accept the idea that you are going to die. Because I need you to be so warm and receptive when someone who struggles with suicidality tells you that they're not sure they can hold on. I need you to be able to respond with 2 words. Thank you. We've got to get to a place in society where there is no shame talking about suicide. And so if you're a person who struggles with suicidality, let me tell you this. At least once a month, for more than 25 years, I've heard a weekly call from the sirens of suicidality. That it takes nothing more than a particularly bad day at the office for me to wonder if I should keep going. And I'm not wrong, I'm not broken, and I'm not a sinner. I'm just someone who survived a really hard life. And so whatever road has brought you to this point in your life, let me say, you are not alone. And I am so glad you're here with us. Thank you.
Mike, thank you for that talk, for your honesty, for challenging us to destigmatize suicide and what that means in our world, and for calling us as a people of faith to stand with compassion and honesty as we address this issue more openly in our world today. Thank you, Mike. Our fourth and final speaker tonight is Dr. Patrick B. Reyes. He has his PhD from Boston University, and he is a Latinx practical theologian and educator who currently works for the Forum for Theological Exploration in Decatur, Georgia. His powerful book, Nobody Cries When We Die, explores the role of narrative and trauma in vocational discernment. When Patrick speaks and leads workshops throughout the country, he's helping communities more fully embody a spirit of justice and peace through spiritual-based practices of healing. Patrick's talk tonight is titled, Wanted, Dead or Alive. Please join me in welcoming Patrick Reyes.
So I love Westerns. It's something about surviving in the wilderness, trying to get the bad guy, the quest for gold or glory. There's just one problem when I watch these films, though. It's that iconic wanted poster. Wanted, dead or alive. You've seen this poster, right? I mean, this is to signal to us, the viewer, who the good guy is and who the bad guy is, or who the bad guy is doing good things. But the wanted poster, for some of us, because in all of these videos is a person of color, Mexican or Indian, usually not brought in alive. So my question is this: what does God want of us who show up on these posters? Now, I work in communities of color, specifically with students and scholars of color, people whose histories and lives have been stolen by the legacies of colonization and slavery. And my expertise in these communities is vocation or call, or simply meaning and purpose. So I'll ask my question again. What does God want of us who are wanted dead or alive? Now, I think our sacred texts, have some really good answers to this. I'm a father of two multicultural, multi-religious children, so we often turn to sacred texts for answers. And we got plenty of stories to choose from. We could choose Moses surviving Pharaoh, Jesus surviving Herod as an infant, or Miriam surviving Egypt, Pharaoh, her brothers, God. But my favorite is Ishmael and Hagar in the book of Genesis. Now let's remember who Hagar is. Hagar is the handmaiden of Sarah, who's the wife of Abraham. And when Abraham and Sarah can't have a kid, Sarah gives Hagar to Abraham. Now she escapes this. She runs out into the wilderness, and we first see God meet Hagar in chapter 16 of Genesis, and says she escaped because they dealt harshly with her. This is the same phrase is used for how the Egyptians treated the Israelites. So she is running for her life. And as she's out there in the wilderness, God says to Hagar, I have heard your cries of distress. And then after telling her she should go back, which I don't understand, but tells you should go back, promises her a son, Ishmael, which means God hears, and promise a great nation will be made of that boy. Now you would think a story like this, okay, good things happen. I mean, it's not Disney though, it's Scripture. So she goes back, and by Genesis chapter 21, they're back at this oppression thing. Sarah has her own child now and tells Abraham, cast them out. So Abraham, the father of Ishmael, only gives them bread and water and sends them on their way. Bread and water. Can you imagine that? Your dad giving you bread and water and sending you on your way? So they're out in the wilderness. The bread runs out. The water runs out. And Hagar pushes Ishmael underneath a bush and turns her eyes to God and says, do not let me watch my boy die. I'm a parent. I can't imagine praying that prayer. Let me pause this story here. When I read this story, I know that boy. I know Ishmael. See, growing up in Salinas, California, it's a small agricultural community known for three things: John Steinbeck, lettuce, and poverty in the lettuce fields because people who pick that lettuce can't afford to put it on their table, and gang warfare. It's got one of the highest rates of gang violence per capita in the entire country. One of my favorite authors, Octavia Butler, in her Parable trilogies, makes a brief stop in Salinas. Her characters surviving post-apocalyptic California find three things in Salinas. They find books, John Steinbeck. They find water, and they find a gun. Now, she may have been writing fiction, but she was writing my life. Because at the age of 12, when my parents split up, my dad, Latino man, just, the perfect dad, got cast out of our house. And my mom invited a stranger to come and move in. Now, this stranger had all the markings of his own trauma, and the way that he dealt with it was abuse and addiction. And so being a young person, only 12, sitting there at my white laminate desk doing my homework one day, I realized it was going to be one of those afternoons. I could hear the stranger downstairs stomping around looking for someone or something to dominate. So for those of us who show up on wanted posters, this was my chance to be a good guy or a bad guy who does good things. So I started slinging insults his way to protect my younger brothers. He comes upstairs, says, I'm going to get you, you brown pow. We start to fight. This 6'2" man trained by our military, inflicting his will on a 5' nothing little Latino boy. I knew Ishmael. Our fight ended with him, his hands around my neck, lifting me up off the ground. God, I remember calling out for my dad, who I imagine was like Hagar, was cast out into the wilderness, not knowing what to do in this moment. So here, right here, This is the moment that it matters to do vocational discernment. When life is on the line, this is when it matters. Who is calling you to life? That is my question. I knew Ishmael. This was my home. This was supposed to be my inheritance. I was supposed to be safe here. I was God's beloved. That's what I had been told. Lucky for me, the text moves on, and so is my story. I'm obviously standing here. So we have Hagar, who's placed Ishmael under a bush to die, turning her eyes to God, saying, "Do not let me watch my son die." And God responds. God has heard the cries of the boy where he is. Go and lift up the boy with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him. And so God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And so she went and filled up her skin with water and gave the boy a drink. Now, something I didn't mention. That first time God and Hagar met, Hagar named God El Roi, which means God of seeing, or God of my seeing, or God who sees. So you have Hagar, who's one of the only people to name God in the Bible. It's the first woman to be named, given a dynasty. Out here, calling out on a God who sees and a God who hears. Ishmael's God hears. That God has heard the cries of the boy where he is. I think we got something special here. God hears and sees the cries of the afflicted where they are, and calls on us who are with them to come and lift them up with our hand. Now, my story didn't end that night either. I remember waking up the next day, sore from the night before, gathering my books, trying to shove them into my backpack. Rushed downstairs, made sure my brothers were okay, get in the car to go to school. And we're on the drive to school, and I remember something. I didn't do my homework. It's amazing what the mind can do in these moments of trauma, that we can think and focus on things that really don't matter that much, like homework. And so as we pull up to the school, the principal who stood outside our school every single day was standing there, and I wanted to do everything I could to get by him as quickly as possible so I could find a small corner of the campus to get my homework done. And as I went by him, still sore, head down, I'm trying to go as fast as I can. I hear those words, "Good morning, Patrick." And I look up at the principal, and my eyes fill with water, and I cannot stop crying. And the only words I can get out are, "I didn't finish my homework." You see, I went to a special school, Christian Brothers School in Salinas, California. My dad had the wherewithal to call me to life, saying that education and faith can save your life. He placed me in this school because he had promised me something great. So I didn't want to miss out on this opportunity. He's one of the only Latinos at this school. As one of the only kids from my side of town, I had this neighborhood on my back as well. I didn't want to lose out on this opportunity. And the principal, seeing this broken young man before him, listened to me and just asked me for one thing. "Can you give me a piece of paper and a pen?" So I get my backpack, hand him a piece of pen, thinking, okay, this is done. I'm gone. And he writes me a note, getting me out of homework for that day. And after seeing me and listening to my story, he says, "You know what, Patrick? We want you here. Take advantage of everything we have here. Do sports, any advanced classes you want to take, extracurriculars. I was in the band yearbook. Anything I could do to stay on campus, you can do." I was wanted. So for every day for 6 years, I got dropped off at about 7 a.m. and left at about 8 p.m. So you can see the thread here, right? That God calls us to life. God hears and God sees and calls us to life. My invitation to you is that this isn't just my story. There's so much happening in the world right now. And whether it's poverty, abuse, addiction, racism, homophobia, we live in a really tricky time in politics. It's a nice way to say, hopefully this is timestamp for a lot of years beyond this. This is a tricky time right now, politically. For people like me who are in education or food deserts, this call to life extends to all of us. So I want to leave you with a few things. If you're like Ishmael, hear me when I see you, and I say to you, I see you, I hear you. Hold on one more day, one more moment. You can make it. God has promised greatness for you. And if you're like the Hagars in the room, we need you to see us, to hear us, and to lift up our head and carry us in so that we can do the work that God has promised us to do. The writer and theologian Howard Thurman is attributed for saying, do not ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come fully alive. And go do it. Because what the world needs is people who come alive. So as you discern the many thresholds in your life, as you navigate jobs, moving, as you think about love, because that's something we discern a lot about, and relationships, as you navigate family and toxic relationships, because that's also something we navigate. Ask these two questions. How am I called to life? And how am I calling others to life? Because after all, you are wanted fully alive. Thank you.
That was great, brother. Thank you so much. Well, Patrick, thank you for that incredible way that you weave together your story and the story of Hagar and Ishmael. And you call us to life by reminding us of all the ways that God is calling us to be fully alive in who we are. This brings us then to the close of TheoEd Talks this evening. I am so thrilled and excited that you were here with us to share in this experience and to listen to these incredible talks. And if anything you've heard tonight has piqued your interest, I encourage you to check out the book table, which is right outside of these doors when you exit. There you'll find selections from all of our various speakers, and you'll have a brief time to meet them and have them sign books that you might purchase. I also encourage you to follow us on Facebook and on Instagram, and be sure to check back into our TheoEd.com website, where you'll soon find versions of these talks in video form online, along with the behind-the-scenes interviews we did with all of our speakers this evening. And most of all, I want to invite each and every one of you to come back and be in that seat. I can't guarantee you'll be in the same seat, but I want to encourage you to come back and join us for our next TheoEd Talks event, which is coming up on Sunday, September 22nd. We have a lineup of 4 incredible speakers. The first is Mihi Kimcourt. Mihi is a PCUSA minister, writer, and storyteller. Her work deals with issues ranging from Asian American feminist theology to the intersection of faith, family, and ministry. Our second speaker is Dr. Ted Smith. Ted is an associate professor of preaching and ethics at Emory's Candler School of Theology, and his amazing work delves deeply into issues of social ethics, economic inequality, and the future of theological education. Our third speaker will be Austin Channing Brown. She's formerly from Willow Creek Community Church and currently serves at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Her work deals with various issues, including multiculturalism, race, and racism. And her most recent book is titled, I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. And our fourth and final speaker is Jonathan Merritt. Jonathan is a graduate of the Candler School of Theology, and he is a prolific author, writing over 3,000 articles for outlets such as the USA Today, Christianity Today, BuzzFeed, and The Atlantic. Jonathan is an incredible speaker and author, and he's just been named one of the top 30 young leaders in the Christian church today. So we would love to have you come back to listen to these 4 speakers. In fact, tickets are on sale now. If you go to TheoEd.com, you can buy your ticket. And from now until Tuesday at noon, we're offering tickets for 50% off. So simply type in the promo code EARLYBIRD, all one word, EARLYBIRD, at checkout for 50% off your tickets. Thank you again for being here tonight and being part of the TheoEd Talks series. We hope we'll see you again in September. Thank you.